This week on The Bench, I'll be talking about how to prep your miniatures using contrast paints. I'm by no means an award-winning miniatures painter. I paint a lot of stuff that's just good enough for the tabletop. So you're talking about a base coat, a wash, doing some dry brushing. And for a lot of my rank and file stuff, I get things that I think are just good enough for the tabletop, and I'm happy with that. But I picked up so many different Kickstarters, especially from Reaper Bones Miniatures, and you just have tons of stuff. So using that traditional base coat, wash, highlight, it's just a lot of work. There's a new product out called contrast paints, and I have some stuff here from Games Workshop and from Vallejo, and they are wonderful options to have for painting. I especially love the Vallejo Xpress color contrast paints. They're great. Now, for Citadel colors, and they're good, but there's two issues I have with them. One is, of course, the cost. They're pretty expensive, about $9. Second of all, the design of these caps, it's just horrible. One, you can never quite get a good seal on it. You got to make sure it's really sealed tightly. Second of all, they're a little top heavy and they're easy to spill over. What I've taken to a lot of times is having a small little dish, if you will, and then put on some blue tack. And then that way I can work with it. And, this way it's a little bit more solid. I don't accidentally flip it over. And if I do, well, it's caught within the confines of the plate, especially, if you knock it over, you can spill it everywhere, and being $9 a pop, that's just a lot of waste. Now, these contrast paints really sort of interesting. They're actually utilize a glaze medium, and they sort of work like a glaze, if you will. They're formulated, they flow very fluidly over a miniature, and they'll get into the cracks and crevices and give a darker shade. And over the highlights of the minis, they'll sort of thin out a little bit like you would have a glaze, a little bit more transparent. So they're not as opaque as regular paints, but they're really good to be working with and adding some washes and shading to your miniatures. Now, I take no credit for thinking this up, but the Slapchop method has sort of become the standard, if you will, for working with contrast paints. The idea is to have a dark undercoat and then dry brush it white. And use maybe even more highlights of white for areas that you really want to capture the light. And the idea is basically to get the gradation of color that you would get through contrast, sort of improving that. So the darker areas are much more darker and the lighter areas are much more lighter. What you see in this first picture here is just some regular underprimed miniatures. I have some Chaos Cultist for Farscave, and some Reaper Bones miniatures. And the Reaper Bones, of course, I don't really need to have those primed, so they're just a regular white type miniature. This next photograph I've used a really thinned down black coat of paint. And the idea is really to get into those recesses and nooks and crannies and give it a black color. So now I use a copious dry brush of white. And the idea here is really to get all the upper regions, not raised parts, get that a really nice white color if you can, just to capture the lighter part of the miniature. Lastly, you'll see here using some Games Workshop contrast. Here you can sort of see the final result. The recesses in the miniatures have that deeper shade of color, and the raised bits will then have a lighter shade. And so this just really allows the contrast paint to work a little bit more effectively on the miniature, as opposed to just using something that's just primed gray or primed black or white. Now here I have a Warlord Games zombie from Project Z, and it's just been underprimed gray to just give it a nice basic look that you'll have. Now you can use model paints for dry brushing, but I actually recommend using craft paints because you're just going to cover so much over the model. This worked fine. If you need to go back and touch up some highlights, then you can always go back to a model paint. Just like your standard paints, you want to basically thin it out just a little bit with water, and you're going to use a little paper towel to get a good dry brush on your bristles there, and just give a real thorough covering of the model. And the idea here is try to maybe effectively, if you can, get over the surfaces as evenly as possible, and then try to go back a bit more and get the areas that would capture a little bit more light, give that a little bit more coating here. Here I'm just working through the side of the figure, want to work in some different directions, make sure you get all those nooks and crannies within the legs and such. And remember, of course, that if you miss a little bit underneath the lower parts of the model, that's fine. That's actually going to sort of work out. What you really want to try to focus on is looking maybe from the top down on the model and capture those parts, let's say the forearm here or the hair at the top of the head, and really make sure that that gets that dry brush of white. Of course, you'll go down through, make sure to get down the shoes, get at least some coverage down there. And, you know, it's pretty easy, pretty quick and dirty in getting that. And you'll get a nice foundation, if you will, of using the contrast paints. As contrast paints go, I'm just a really big fan of Vallejo. They have the dropper bottles. They're reasonably priced, about half the price that you get from the Games Workshop contrast paints. Now, of course, when they first came out, they had a sort of a limited line, and I could see some people sort of complaining about not having the paint range. That is no longer the case. You just have so many options here. Some really vibrant colors on down to darker shades and more neutral shades. You just have so many choices, and they're just, to me, a great paint to work with and use. To wrap up, working with contrasts, it's best to use the Slapchop method. That'll really lay the foundation down to help make those contrasts work better. And in fact, if you're using Vallejo Xpress paints, it's just enough to go ahead and do a dry brush over a gray primer. That'll also work wonders with that type of paint.